Commander, I cannot recommend that our proud infantry charge the enemy guns on the front. It's a suicide mission. This is a job better left to the light cavalry. You cannot expect us to take on such a ridiculous task. Just do it. Well, welcome my friends, welcome. I'm your host Jolo, and today we'll be asking the question, should you play Pixel Soldiers Waterloo? The first of many games of its kind written by Jolly Pixel, and this is a game I stumbled across looking for something in the Napoleonic era. It's kind of mood I'm in on my hobby channel. I'm doing some Napoleonics, something to kind of get me into the era. And if you've never heard of this game before, I'm not really surprised, because looking at the App Store, looking at the website, there is actually no video on this game attached to the page. Just some nice little pictures. There's some very positive reviews, but the game isn't much to look at. You kind of need to see it in flow. So yeah, and also because the game is effectively behind a paywall, if you will, because you had to pay that €2 to get in. I'd really like to see Jolly Pixel release a demo version of Waterloo, or one of their games, to kind of give people a taste of what they're getting in for, because all these games are kind of very similar in terms of the package that they offer. So yeah, I think a demo game would definitely help in terms of getting this game out there. And I felt like it was good enough to do a video on. And it has really the feel of an Avalon Hill board game. If you've ever played any of those, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We move the little tokens across the board. In terms of the game itself, you have a campaign mode where you can play as the British, the French of course, and also the Prussians, which is always a nice bonus. In terms of the units, there's quite a variety in the units as well. And yeah, I mean it's a decent selection. It also has a two-player mode, which is quite interesting. And as you play the campaign itself, you begin to unlock more maps that you can play in two-player mode. And the way it does two-player is essentially it's a pass-the-phone style game. I play a lot of tabletop games with my brother on the second channel. And the one thing that we always have is sometimes that we tend to favor skirmish games because they take less time to set up and break down. But this really has that feel of a miniatures game built into it. So if you're into miniature games or you're curious about miniature tabletop stuff, I think Pixel Soldiers Waterloo is a nice kind of one where you could whip it out. You know, there's no real setup. The rules are fairly intuitive, but it has the sort of rock paper scissors trifecta of all war game strategies, which is the infantry are strong against the cavalry are strong against the guns, and the artillery guns are strong against the infantry. So you have this loop of units that informs on all the different tactics you can employ in the game. It even has a bit of flanking tactics as well. So for example, if you attack from one side and then you attack from a different side, the different side will be counted as a flanking maneuver. So there is, even though there's no quote-unquote basing of the units because of the way they're designed as tiles, there actually is in terms of how you attack them. So I like that there's a little extra layer there of complexity added on. I even managed to play a game with my son, who's only 4 years old, just throwing out a couple of units on the blank sandbox board, and he was moving them around. But no game is perfect, and this game certainly isn't perfect. I've praised it in a lot of different ways, but there is one aspect of the game which felt a bit weak. If you look at the sandbox game where you build your armies and you have different units available to you, you have lots of interesting types of options in terms of infantry. And it can actually be a little bit overwhelming sometimes. You're trying to say, well, what's the difference between the infantry? They all have muskets, they all have rifles. What exactly am I getting here? What's the difference? And through playing the game, I've learned that the only stat that really matters is morale. So the higher your unit's morale is, the better the unit is. So the unit with the lowest morale in the game is the Dutch infantry, which I think the infantry belongs to the British, and they are essentially, you can almost think of them like mercenaries, or they used to work for the French and now they're working for the British. So the low morale doesn't necessarily represent that the unit is cowardly. It just represents that it's not committed to the battle as such, and that tends to play out for the more civilian style infantry as well, and conscripts and so on. And then you get up to the higher levels, the Imperial Guard and the Old Guard of the French and so on, and they have the highest morale of the lot. So morale is the big factor there, and it helps kind of simplify the infantry. But then you come to the cavalry, and there is a huge variety of cavalry in the Napoleonic setting. You have lancers and hussars and so on, but in the game this is simplified to light cavalry and heavy cavalry, which I feel is a little bit too much of an oversimplification, especially if we could just use morale to create new cavalry units. Like, where are the Lancers? Where are the Hussars? I'd love some Dragoons or some Scott Greys. I think it would add an extra layer. There's quite a variety of cavalry, and I wasn't expecting this to be simplified down to 2 units compared to the infantry, which is not. So this creates, like, it's not necessarily a bad thing to simplify the cavalry, but it sticks out in a game in which the infantry has been diversified, but the cavalry hasn't. So just a couple of extra units in the cavalry, maybe even to add a bit more variety among the different factions will be very interesting. And then we kind of have a question mark hanging over artillery. Again, there was a bit of variety in artillery. In the Napoleonic setting, you had foot infantry, which had more of the heavier guns, and you had the horse artillery, which had the lighter guns but were more mobile. Now in the game, it has one unit of artillery called foot artillery, but it moves at a pace of a horse. It moves as fast as the cavalry is, from what I can see. So in my mind, it's a bit of an unusual unit. It seems to be halfway between a foot artillery and a cavalry artillery. An improvement I would make in that regard, I would just rename that unit to horse artillery, and then create a new unit using the same sprite called foot artillery, and just make it more powerful, give it a bigger gun, but it moves much slower, which would kind of capture that difference. I don't think that'd be a big change to make. It wouldn't really require very much. Although I don't really feel, I feel that having one artillery unit in the game doesn't really hinder the game. It's just a little bit of an odd one, because you notice how fast it moves, and it's called foot artillery. You're kind of wondering why is the foot artillery so fast? Why does it move so quickly compared to cavalry and other units? Is this actually a horse artillery? Is it a foot artillery? That's a little bit confusing. The thing is, for the amount of effort that's gone into this game, and for as good as the game is, it's strange that for such a small amount of, it's just a little bit more time, like not a huge amount more, added just in a couple more units, a little bit of sprite work. The sprites are very basic in this game. You get a lot more. You get a lot more value, I feel, for what could effectively be 2 or 3 days work, just creating a few more sprites and adding them in. Now maybe you need to playtest it and so on. So there's more to consider there. But in terms of physical creating the units and just change the morale on some of the horses and so on, I don't think there's a huge amount to do to make this game really just completely fleshed out. Now a level editor, that's a different story. But yeah, there's definitely a lot here for what you get. There's some improvements I think that could be made for the cavalry. And one thing that is very interesting is that the game, when you think Napoleonic, so if I ask a random person what they think of Napoleon, well, maybe I shouldn't ask a random person, they don't necessarily know that, I don't know how popular the setting is, but if I ask someone who's into the setting, what's the first thing they think of when I say Napoleonics? It's either going to be Napoleon himself, the Battle of Waterloo, or it's going to be the square formation. So units forming squares. This game doesn't allow your infantry to form into a square to defend against cavalry. And that is a weird feeling for me coming into a Napoleonic game. But after playing the game for a while and playing other games that implement the square, I actually appreciate the fact that it isn't there, which is a weird thing to say, because what ends up happening is when you implement the square, you start implementing other formations. You're basically implementing micromanagement on the infantry level. And it's not something you really want to get into, because the doctrine is, like in terms of historical, that when a infantry unit is charged by cavalry, they almost always automatically form square. And in the rule system of the game itself, cavalry are weak against infantry. So I kind of feel like, well, there's not really reason to implement formations and all this other nonsense. That kind of bogs down all these other competitors to this game with micromanagement that doesn't need to be there. Perhaps you could add something to make, like, once the unit is attacked by a cavalry, it can't move until the next turn to kind of represent the square, I guess. But really there isn't much to be done there. I kind of mention it as an oddity, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. And the more it actually makes the game better, that the square isn't implemented like as something you do. It's implemented as cavalry are weak against infantry up close in combat. So it makes a lot of sense. It's strange that it's not there, but it makes a lot of sense. And places I actually would like to see the developer take this game, because he has a couple of games on the American Civil War and he has one on World War I, but he hasn't revisited the Napoleonic setting in quite a while. And there is one expansion I would love to see, which would be the Peninsular War. I'd love to see some Spanish guerrilla fighters thrown in there, some different factions. I think it's a very interesting setting. Like, it could be an expansion, an update, or its own game on its own right. Or I'd love to see them maybe tackle the Battle of Trafalgar and just do a full-on boat campaign game. Just, no infantry, no land, just all boats, ships to the line and HMS Victory and all that kind of stuff. And just go for that, because they have played around with boats in their World War One game, which is also available in the same store. So it'll be interesting to see them just go in that route completely, make a fully naval-based game set in the Napoleonic setting. I think there's a lot there. Let's just see how many American-style games that they actually have. Yeah, they have 3 American games. I'm no expert on the American setting, but you have Saragata, you have Gettysburg, and Bull Run. So I think they're all American Civil War stuff. So if you're an expert in that, you have a lot of value there. But we only have one Waterloo, one Napoleonic. Why is this? We need more. So that brings back to the question: should you play Pixel Wars Waterloo? I think if you are looking for a game that isn't bogged down in the micromanagement of Napoleonics and captures that kind of wide-scale feeling of Napoleonics, you're also looking for something that captures a bit of that tabletop feel, that bit of that Avalon Hill board game feel that maybe you haven't had in a while or you've never personally had to experience. I think this game has a lot to offer. If you're looking for something that's a bit more, I guess, skirmish level, more man-to-man, this wouldn't be the game for you. And really, if you're looking at Napoleonics, you shouldn't be thinking in terms of skirmish level anyway. I think, generally speaking, there probably is better settings to look at for skirmish. So yeah, if you're just someone who doesn't have time to play the tabletop games of old, or you miss the big battles, because a lot of the tabletop stuff has gone skirmish. If you miss the old big battles and you just want something quick and handy to play, like a game with this, depending on the scale, can definitely be played in an hour quite easily. And if you leave the game, it saves the game automatically. You don't lose anything. It just goes back. You quit the game, you put it in back your pocket. Like, for €2, I have gotten far less value from other things. So overall I praise Jolly Pixel. Some minor criticisms, but overall a great game.